G'day legends, I hope that you're all doing well. Now I'd like to thank Jonas for coming on the podcast today and speaking to me about his time both in the German military and then through serving in Ukraine, and one of the first guys really to come across very early in the war and fight in places you may have heard of like Bucha, Irpin, and other areas through the south as well, and fighting against the Russians, different units and some treatment. And I think gives a lot of perspective in this very open, honest chat that I wish went a lot longer. Now, if you're a German speaker, his book is published in German, and I'll have a link for that below. But I'd just really like to thank him. Now, if you do see me peering off at any point, I do take a lot of notes in my worst handwriting in the world. So that's just what I'm doing. But thank you, Jonas, so much. And thank you for you guys listening and all the support you've given me and this channel, and the ability for guys to come on and speak to me like this. I really appreciate it. And as always, my email is also below, that if you would like to reach out and join one of these interviews, send your background. It doesn't matter who, where, what, send it across. I'm very interested. Thank you so much. And thank you if you're just listening as well. I really appreciate it. Oh, g'day, mate. How's everything going?
It's good. The heat is killing me, but aside from that, I'm pretty good.
How warm is it where you are?
Probably not warm compared to where you are, but we've been cruising at 30 degrees, which is outrageous here, and it's pretty damn humid, so you really, really feel it.
Yeah, well, for those who don't know, you're in Germany, so I guess 30 degrees is warm for that.
Yeah.
Firstly, do you want to go by Jonas or Kaiser or?
But you can use them interchangeably. Kaiser, Jonas. Mostly Jonas is fine. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Jonas, firstly, mate, thank you for joining me and willing to speak to me. And I've been back and forth for a couple of weeks, and I've been all over the place.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
No, mate, trust me, the pleasure's mine. So let's turn back a little bit, I guess, before Ukraine and talk about where your military career actually started.
Right. So my military career is really unremarkable. I I decided late in school that I wanted to like at least give it a try, and I at least wanted to try like the frontline infantry. So I went to the Panzer Grenadiers, the mechanized infantry. Spent there a couple of years, then went to Afghanistan. But from like immediately, it was obvious for me that I wanted to have a career in the military. So yeah, I sold my soul and went to become an officer. But after not even a year of officer training, I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't take the new unit, the military life. Not even the military life, but the way things were being done in that unit anymore. And I became so disillusioned with the German military, and the infantry in particular, that I decided to go. That process took a while, and it wasn't until February 2022 that I left the army.
Oh, so fairly recently, and the same month that Ukraine was then subsequently invaded.
Fortuitous coincidence, I suppose.
Yes. And how was your tour through Afghanistan?
Really short and really uneventful. So I was there after ISAF got canned, and I was with Resolute Support. So we were purely stabilizing missions. It was very, very interesting experience, and helped to cement some like basic soldiering stuff, some basic soldiering values, I suppose. But I was never under fire in Afghanistan. I never fired a shot in anger, and I actually had to leave Afghanistan earlier than most of my comrades because I injured myself.
Right. What year was that?
That was 2019.
Okay, I was there on the same mission only 2 years earlier. So the
Oh, where?
same
Where were
resolute
you?
support. I was on Karga Camp Karga. Um, Trying to think what it might have been called otherwise. So
Was
um,
was 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 that in the south? or what
I'm,
tuck were you in?
I'm trying to now bloody envision the map. It's been that long, and I thought there were a lot since. Um, it was, I believe, southwest of Kaya.
Huh. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I was purely in the north. I was in Mazar-e Sharif and Kunduz.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, definitely like, that's Germany's main area, really. I've never seen Kabul. I've never seen Kandahar. So
Yeah, we only had the Germans turn up maybe once on our base, and I got smashed in trouble for it like instantly because they rocked up, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is cool. Like I've never worked with the Germans. Like, can we eat at your mess? And I'm like, yeah, go for it, lad. Just go and eat. Knowing full well, I didn't know this, but definitely did not have any authorization to civilian contractors. But just like, who's the dickhead that let all these guys eat for nothing? I'm like, who gives a shit? It's like $20.
politically, we didn't have a permanent base, so we couldn't have a kitchen. So we were eating MREs for just months on end. And we went to US soldiers and were like, "Hey guys, please just make some extra mac and cheese in your field kitchen and give us some." And we trade back and forth. We gave them some supplies and they give us rippets or the massive fucking brake lights, not brake lights. What do you call them? Chem lights. Chem
Oh
lights.
yeah, yeah. Did you ever go to any like Bagram, like the big American bases where there was like Burger King and stuff? We didn't too often, but it was crazy.
Yeah, I only heard the stories because after ISAF, the Piate Kunduz was scrapped. So, there we got all the older comrades had like the stories of like, oh yeah, fucking American mess halls with like chocolate cake and fries and
Yeah,
burgers and all that good stuff. That is just unimaginable, right? In Germany, the German army, and I'm sure other armies have it as well, is the saying of basic training prepares you for combat, and the mess hall prepares you for being a prisoner of war.
yeah. That's true. I know the Australian Army, I believe, per soldier per day, food is less than our own prisoners per day, and we used to always laugh about that. And I think even our healthcare, it's something like that. Like if you're in prison, you'd get better healthcare and better food, but I can't complain about either. To be honest, I was pretty lucky.
Isn't everyone on that island on a prison? I mean, technically speaking.
Technically speaking, but it's the most stupid decision the British ever made. Like
Yeah.
you've gone from this small, overcast island that's right on the coast of where there's so much political unrest, and then shipped your prisoners off to one of the most beautiful, resource-rich places on earth that has like no neighbors who want to kill you.
And then they bred like rabbits.
Exactly. So when was it that you got out of the German military, which my understanding of the German military is very very limited? You got out and then decided that you wanted to go to Ukraine. Was it instantly, or how did you go when you saw that Ukraine was happening from the 24th of Feb onwards?
So personally, I saw the war coming by the end of but by the beginning of the year, by the beginning of 2022. For me, what to me showed that the war was going to definitely happen was NATO's unwillingness to send soldiers, to send boots on the ground to defend Ukraine. So in my mind, I had these thoughts from the start of like, technically, if I'm out and there's war, I could maybe do something about it, but it never really clicked until the war actually broke out and it became the new reality that we found ourselves in. And I was furious with the war. I was disgusted by the fact that it happened, the fact that we in the West, and that is still my conviction, that we in the West let it happen. Um, so as soon as I heard about the International Legion, and that was technically even before I left the army. So I already had the idea, I already had the spark in my head before I officially left the army. So yeah, There was one defining moment, really defining moment for me was a peace convention, a peace protest in my hometown, where the mayor of the city held like a speech, and she just perfectly summed up all the idiocy and all the blind pacifism that really stifled German diplomacy at the start of the war, where a couple days after the invasion, right? So after Russian cruise missiles had already struck Ukrainian neighborhoods, struck civilian targets in Ukraine, she said that we still have to fight with the weapons of dialogue, with the weapons of diplomacy. And that was just a red flag for me. Say this is unacceptable rhetoric. This is so far off from reality that really emboldened me to this decision.
Do you think that yourself being a German and Russia's history had a lot to do with this, seeing the war of aggression happening and then choosing to take up arms against that?
No. That was a purely personal decision. I'm not a fan of these kinds of trains of thoughts of like, oh, as a German, and a lot of people have this kind of idea that because we're Germans, because of the Second World War, we have some kind of extra responsibility to peace or extra responsibility to democratic values. Personally, I don't feel that way. I'm not haunted. I'm not responsible for my ancestors' guilt, and that is not affecting my decisions in any way.
No, and I think you're very right on this as well. So you saw red flags in Germans' political sort of diplomacy towards how they were initially treating this conflict.
Yeah. The German diplomacy, and this is not just about Russia, although Russia perfectly, or the Ukraine war perfectly brought it to light. There was this blind pacifism, this blind idea that, ultimately everybody just wants peace. Everybody just wants peace just as much as we want peace, and nobody actually wants a war. Nobody really would ever start a war. So that is why our diplomats kept running to the Kremlin, like one after the other, one major politician after the other kept running to the Kremlin, when to me it was already obvious that the war is going to happen. Like a guy like Putin, when NATO is telling him that they won't intervene militarily, that's the red carpet for a man like that. And it was just infuriating to see the politicians of my country not understand that.
And do you think that NATO was correct in not putting boots on the ground, or should have we deployed boots?
It's hard to say with the way the conflict worked out now. I think for Ukraine, for the people of Ukraine, it would have been better, because I still believe that if NATO had made a full and credible commitment to putting boots on the ground, to say any attack on Ukraine is an attack on NATO and will revoke any conventional response that NATO has to offer, that would have been enough to deter Putin. Putin could have only been deterred by the notion or the fear that the conflict is going awry. And Putin definitely knew that he couldn't fight NATO in its full strength, and that he definitely couldn't do so under the guise of a special military operation.
So you say, and I am in the same boat as yourself, where you say you saw it coming. And this is the reason I was in Ukraine filming 4 or 5 weeks before the invasion. How do you think that this wasn't, well, it must have been seen in intelligence circles, but why do you believe that it wasn't acted on further? We sort of acted weeks or months after that initial shot fired.
That is a really good question. I think in a lot of intelligence circles, they saw it coming, when it was already too late. So after, the NATO announced that they won't intervene militarily, I think a lot of leaders thought that if that is the case, and there's nothing they could do, because sure, they could have sent weapons, but nobody thought Ukraine would do as well as they did, and nobody really saw Ukraine even being alive after the first month of the conflict. So, of course, when you have that in your mind, that's of course a risk to send any kind of advanced aid, because then, of course, it's going to fall into Russian hands. If we had sent Leopards in February, let's say, and Ukraine had held up the way we expected them to hold up, then those would be now in Russian hands.
And that is something I think you touch on, which I've talked about a little bit, was I think the way that some of these weapon systems have been deployed into the country, into Ukraine, does show that there was a belief from the West that Ukraine wouldn't last out the war. And I've spoken about this. For instance, the most popular topic is the F-16 aircraft. That if we truly believed Ukraine was going to last a year, we would have been training the pilots day one, and they would have had them 8 months ago. And it took them 14 months, 15 months of the war for the West to have any movement on, okay, we'll think about training your pilots now.
Yeah, and that's kind of, it's hard to understand for me, because maybe it's because I saw the war going on the ground, but after March, it was pretty obvious that Russia would not have a sweeping victory. After the retreat from Kiev, any hope of like a Russian breakthrough, a big Russian advance, right? Russia retaking any major cities was crushed. And that should have been the wake-up call, really, for Western leaders to say, okay, at this point, Russia won't just give up. Russia won't let go. So we should start thinking about a longer war. The problem is that a lot of Western leaders, especially in Germany, didn't want that. Germany, especially in the beginning, didn't want Ukraine to win because they knew it was going to take years, at least a year. And especially back then, German economy was incredibly dependent on Russian gas and other exports, as well as importing to Russia. And the chief advisor of the German chancellor actually talked about ending the war prematurely to make sure it's more important to build relations with Russia after the war than to help Ukraine win. That should be more important for the German chancellor. And this really encapsulates the problem, is that Germany didn't want to send weapons in the beginning of the war, according to my estimation, what I think, because they saw that Russia couldn't be defeated fast, and the only way for this war to end quickly, which is what they really wanted for a lot of economic and humanitarian reasons, was to make Ukraine lose in some way, even if it's just the South and the Donbass.
Yeah, you touch on some really, really important things there. And so I was just taking a couple of notes. As Germany, we know, was very dependent on Russian gas and things like this. While you're away or while you're at home, has there been a shift in gas prices and inflation from normal?
Oh God, yes. Yes. So it really hit me like a truck when I came back from Ukraine, because I left at the start of the war, and even back then, like even in the week after the war, gas ballooned up by 50% at least, sometimes even 80% in price. We paid like €2, 30 cents for 1 liter of gas or benzene, so diesel. So insane prices at the beginning, but the cost of living wasn't that bad. When I came back from Ukraine in December, I was just shocked just going to the groceries, and average shopping, everyday grocery shopping turned out to be almost twice as expensive as I remembered it, which was an especial shock because in Ukraine, of course, everything is so relatively to Germany goddamn cheap. So it really felt like jumping in the cold water.
And has any of that settled throughout this conflict, or till now?
It's gotten a bit better,
Right.
but it's still really uncomfortable. The cost of living is really uncomfortably high.
Yeah, I think that's being felt not only in Germany, but I think that's being felt in most countries around the world. Even Australia, which isn't dependent on Russia really at all. Even we're feeling it as well. Like I think that's the fight of the average person in the West is against the invisible tax of inflation.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's and this is why I kind of understand why especially lower income households don't want to hear about Ukraine and why they don't support Ukraine. I honestly understand it. Personally, I think that the state should still support Ukraine and the average German citizen should still support Ukraine. But I have absolute sympathy for the people that just don't know how to make ends meet because of the war.
Yes, and that's very difficult. And you would have experienced very similar to this, like in Afghanistan, where you'd go to a village somewhere, in a valley, and you would have like these people know that the Taliban are very bad people, but this warlord who runs this area, who controls security, also gives these people food and water and electricity, and that warlord and his guys who will cut deals with the Taliban, that we would never take over that control because they're like, yeah, we know that. So, for instance, we deal well with General Sharif, I believe, the Kabul butcher, and it was like everyone here is on his side because he's given them a chance for education and food and water, whatever. Even if hearts they know he's not good, that you need to put yourself in the shoes of someone struggling along like that. That if you or I, the difference for us and our children was to support something we may not in our heart, but it puts food on the table and security. Well, it's hard
Absolutely.
to judge. It's hard to judge against that.
And it's not. I mean, it's good if it brings food on the table, water, and security. But what I found out is that a lot of the times the people support the Taliban simply because they bring security. Because as draconian as the Taliban rule is, even before they took over the government, again, and even if people disagree with that, the Taliban controlled districts have more rule and more relative order than a lot of coalition-held cities, and as bad as it is to live under the Taliban, as a farmer, at least you only have to worry about the Taliban, because in some of before the Taliban took over, you'd have to worry about the Taliban and the local warlord and the local organized crime, and if you're unlucky, an American drone bombing the shit out of you. So as much as they might have hated the Taliban bring relative stability, and in a country with what 40 years of more or less continuous war, they just want stability, and you can't blame them for it.
Yes, absolutely. It's easy to sit back in our ivory towers in Western countries and judge people who are just trying to put food on the table. And
I hate this attitude. So much. Yeah.
Chaos and order. That a lot of people would rather order under a dictator or a dictatorship than chaos and freedom. And it's very interesting to read about what true freedom is and true order and chaos, and where in between that, and how people long for that in some ways.
Yeah. It's this is kind of, and I don't want to devolve too much into geopolitics, but that is why that's really the tragedy of the Arab Spring, and the reason why, for example, I think Assad is the lesser of many evils in Syria, because they overthrew a lot of dictators, a lot of ruthless people during the Arab Spring, and they just, what did they replace them with? More ruthless people now vying for power, slavery that came back, civil strife that is in some places it's still not ending. And Yeah, and I think that's a really important lesson to learn, that sometimes the most unjust order is better than chaos.
Yes. And you see, I think a great example of this is, say, Iraq. That is the average farmer Iraqi better off now after we went there for years, bombed the shit out of things and took out a maybe dictatorial government than having nothing and chaos. I know Iraq now, like right these days, is different, but over the last 20, 30 years, it's a very interesting thing to look at. But where I want to go on this was, how do you think that the average German has seen this war in the change from when it started and to where they are now? As you said, there's been a shift in the politics, and people are influenced by that political structure. That were they in the beginning siding with the politics of, we don't want anything to do with this, we want it over with, till now, are they more supportive?
So generally, the Germans are very supportive of Ukraine when it comes to all things civilians, right? The amount of aid that we like, civilian aid that we send, at the beginning of the war, there were more aid packages and donations than we had trucks to send them over. And everyone here is sheltering refugees. There's, a village with more cows than people, and we have like 3 or 4 refugees living here. That really hasn't changed. Of course, there's been criticisms, especially from the far right and the far left, but generally, the German people are very united pro-Ukraine, but only as it comes to civilian matters. As when it comes to military matters, a lot of Germans don't support sending weapons to Ukraine. A lot of Germans are worried about Putin's threat of nuclear war, and a lot of Germans still have this kind of this weird blind pacifist mindset of oh yeah, first we stop sending weapons, and then we talk, and then everything will be fine. Peace at all costs. Peace at all costs, which is really infuriating attitude to me.
Do you think that there is a almost Soviet hangover of people's belief of the power of Russia, thinking that the power was the same as the Soviet Union, especially, say, in Germany, that had occupied areas till, in the 90s or very early, that I think a lot of people, when they think of Russia's influence and power, are thinking of the Soviet Union's influence and power, not so much the transition into Russia. Because when you watch a James Bond film that's in the Soviet power was huge. It was very similar to the Americans. And I think we take that power as what it remains. And although the nuclear power remains very similar, do you think that there's Germans who are scared of, hey, it was only 30 years they occupied bits of here, their overarching power was this big, and haven't really caught up with the times of not being one of those great military superpowers?
I think this mindset is still prevalent everywhere, not the least in the minds of the Russians, unfortunately. I definitely think so. So, and even when I talk to friends, or when I talk to like my parents or people around here, they often think of the Russian army as this massive Soviet juggernaut that dominated media, and that could dominate Western Europe at any point, when in reality it's a paper tiger at worst. Yeah, there's definitely a Soviet hangover. There's definitely this big mischaracterization. Um, it's still left over. It's not as bad as it was before the war, but it's definitely still there.
Yeah, oh, for sure. So, in seeing this happen, you get that red flag off one of the politicians. How long after that, like what month, did you decide that you were going to head to Ukraine?
Well, I decided to head to Ukraine right away, but I had to do some preparations. First of all, I had to get in contact with the embassy, which took quite a while actually. I had some unfinished business in Germany that I had to take care of before I leave. So it wasn't until the 13th of March that I got there, and I actually crossed the border into Ukraine the day the missile strike
Mm,
on the base in Yavrov hit,
yes,
and the next day, I was recruited into the Legion.
yes. What did your family think of your decision?
Well, I didn't ask them at first, so I knew they were not going to like it, and of course they didn't like it, which is why I only told them minutes in advance. I said, oh, I'm going to visit a friend, and after that, you know, I'm going to Ukraine, and I'll see you some other day. And my mother was crying. My father was really broken up about it. They tried to, call me. They tried to plead with me to come back. But in the end, I went anyways.
Yeah. And what was your first, like, initial um, sightings in Ukraine? What was your first thoughts as you entered?
So I've been to Eastern Poland once, so I know how bleak the countryside can be in Eastern Europe. But when I went across the border and like 100 meters off from the Granice, then the border post, it was so much worse. Like immediately you cross the border and you're in another country. Um, I just thought to myself, man, this is sad. Um, because you've been to Ukraine, I don't know how things work in Australia, but in Germany we have green grass all time of the year. And when you go to Ukraine in winter, it's all gray. There is nothing green anywhere. Everything is just green. Everything is just gray and bleak. And there's just, you know, shitty little houses in the distance, little villages, tiny villages, shitty little houses that look straight out of Resident Evil 8. Um, and the only beacon of light that I saw really were the churches with the nice gold-plated and brightly colored roofs that you know were like little bonfires in the distance. But yeah, my first impression was just fucking bleak.
Yeah, and there is a difference in crossing from the EU line into Ukraine. You do notice that, like, um, the affluence when you're going the other way into Poland. You're like, oh, there is a dramatic change there. Even the border post, like you'll be on the Polish border post compared to the Ukrainian border post. There is a clear sign of the economic difference there. At least that's what I saw initially.
I didn't have that. It was like a single complex, so
Mm.
it looked like it was jointly built and operated. But I mean, the one thing you noticed immediately was the kind of attitude. So the Poles were more relaxed, carrying the usually service attire, while the Ukrainian border guards, of course, with Kalashnikov and Beka and how do you say in English?
Oriyama.
Yeah, body armor, um, ballistic vests. That was the one thing that struck me. Other than that, I didn't see much of a difference at that specific crossing.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, you speak very well on the grey. You cross it sometimes the year, and because I've been in and out, and you've been there a long time, it's beautiful and spring and colourful. And then, like, sort of in the winter, it's like the grey Soviet era buildings, the grey
Oh yeah.
ground, the cars are covered in like the ice and salt that's grey. And you're like, whoa, this is, because I remember when I was there late January, early Feb, it's like out in like Kharkiv, like, well, this could be a bit depressing. But the people I found were like so lovely. Maybe it's an Eastern European thing compared to like Western Europe. But I think the people, I always say to people, that the further east you go, I reckon the more lovely the people get. Um, Maybe it's just more communal. I'm not sure.
Could be. I'm not sure about it either, but yeah, the people, the average Ukrainian people, especially the people in the villages were so lovely and genuine and full of gratitude. Really, really lovely people, and I really appreciated that. Although I also had a lot of negative experiences with Ukrainians.
And yeah, we'll get into that as we go through. So you cross over, and then where's your movements from there into Lviv? Lviv.
So I got like a preliminary direction where to go. They were like, "Oh yeah, go there to some kind of some gas station, and then you get recruited." By the time I got there, that was already gone, and I had to go somewhere else. I find this so beautiful because it's perfectly encapsulates the later experience of the Legion for me. We went to a children's theater, like a little children's theater, and there we had to wait for the Legion officers to look at us and to recruit us. And then they send off to this base in Yavorov. Like I said, fresh struck by the missiles. And we were housed in tents and waited to be processed, waited to be given our guns, waited to be told where we would fight and when.
So if I'm remembering correctly, that missile strike on the base just before you got there, that killed a number of foreign volunteers.
No,
Oh,
no.
must be.
So everyone hears different things. I've also heard this number of 200 volunteers. That missile in our base wounded one person, but I know that there were other missile strikes because it's really a base complex. It's multiple bases and a big training area. In other bases nearby, there were strikes that killed dozens of Ukrainian soldiers, but the area where the volunteers was actually untouched because they were not housed in the actual base. They were housed in tents outside. So as far as I know, as far as I could tell, there were at least no significant number of foreign casualties.
Yeah. And how was the Legion at that time? Because I was in Ukraine around that same time, and I was seeing some volunteers come back through who were like leaving, who had horror stories of the Legion at that time. What was your initial thoughts?
So, yeah, I went in there very hopeful. And it for me, it took a lot of time to really understand the Legion for what it was. The first thing that I noticed was that there was zero discipline at all. Zero discipline, but also zero oversight. Nobody really cared what we were doing. We're just maybe once a day, maybe once in 2 days, somebody came and told us what to do, and we were just hanging out. People were discussing amongst themselves and taking initiatives by themselves, which never went anywhere. It was just disorganized, and there was a distinct problem with people who said that they knew what they were doing, but obviously didn't know what they were doing. So we had people giving us, and foreigners, right? Not Ukrainian, foreigners were giving us like training with pistol, for example, that was so utterly devoid of any reason or safety that it really was just staggering. But like I said, it took me a lot of time to realize just how problematic the Legion was at that point.
And did it get better throughout your time there?
Through my time, no. Oh God, no. I jumped ship the moment I saw a better opportunity to fight for Ukraine, which is why I left in June and joined an independent group that sought to join the ZSU, the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and that is where I saw most of my action.
Right. So before we get in there, can you just tell us about that few months between getting into the Legion and then leaving then for the better units?
Yeah, so we were sent to Kiev relatively soon. We had a group that was really just the person who were in the tent with us, most of which spoke English, and a few Germans who just didn't speak any English at all. There was a lot of translating going on, and we only had a single paravodchik, so only a single person who spoke Russian and could translate with the Ukrainians. We were then sent to Kiev. We went to Sasha's palace. This very particular base became infamous through a Kiev Independent article that really detailed the misuse of power, the corruption, and failings of the Legion. From there we went to Bucha and Irpin. At that point, I was the leader of my own little unit. I had about 12 guys, mostly English speaking, a few Poles, a few Germans, and we first went to Irpin. We came under pretty heavy fire. I think we were under almost continuous artillery fire for 2 days and 2 nights until the Ukrainian artillery pushed the Russians back. At which point we were taken back and grouped into a task force that's supposed to reclaim Bucha. So that was mostly us foreigners and a bunch of Belarusian volunteers under Ukrainian command that went there, and we were actually the first Ukrainian fighters in Bucha since the occupation of Bucha. Yeah, that is where I saw I'd say the bulk of Russian war crimes. We saw a lot of fucked up stuff, especially in Bucha, and really the things we saw in Bucha were really something that we didn't find anywhere else in Ukraine, not in Irpin and not in Kramatorsk and not in Kherson. At least my unit didn't.
And if it's not rude to ask, can you tell us about some of what you saw in Bucha?
Yeah. So in Bucha, we were brought to an OP between Bucha and Vozel. We crossed the Bucha and made our way through the main road. And I mean, first of all, there was just a lot of destruction. The entire blocks, entire supermarkets or hypermarkets, which is crushed. There were civilian and military vehicles burned out everywhere, and there were corpses just everywhere, just littering the streets. Men, women, children. I saw a little child in like a pastel colored bomber jacket just lying on the side of the road somewhere. I saw a man and a woman just lying by the sidewalks, face up with a bullet or with a hole in their forehead. We noticed that it was different from Irpin, although in Irpin there were a lot of civilian casualties, most of which though seemed to just be from artillery. We noticed that it was different in Bucha. We noticed that it was not the same, but none of us really understood the scope of what we witnessed until we got back to base 2 days later.
Yeah. And how does that feel now talking about it? And how have you dealt with things like that? Because, first coming under fire and then going through something like that.
It definitely hardened us, I guess. It definitely made us more resilient because we've, for a lot of us, that was the first taste of war, of what war had to offer. And we already made it through some of the worst things that war can offer. And of course, it showed us what we're fighting for. It showed us why we are here and why we need to stay here. I went to Ukraine with this kind of starry-eyed notion of, I'm going to go to Ukraine and I'm going to fight there and I'm going to be home by June so I can, no matter how the war turns, I'll be home by June so I can start my medicine. I can start studying medicine. And that I gave up. And I realized just how silly it really was, this notion of, I'm going to war, and I'm going to be home when it's no longer convenient to me. And at that point, I understood that I need to fight as long as I can.
Yeah. And you guys were the first ones into Bucha. And did you have artillery first and then you're pushing out the Russians, or was it street to street initially?
So the artillery had been working the days before that, and the Russians were already retreating. We did not make contact with the enemy. The enemy was already well on its way to pull back behind Belarusian borders. So, yeah.
And then where from there did you end up going?
From there, we were supposed to. It was quite a lengthy period of restructuring and reorganizing, which brought a little bit of organization to the Legion, not as much as really needed. And then we were sent off to the south, to Mykolaiv, and we're supposed to go on missions there. We went to missions there, although there was a lot of bullshit that came between us and the missions, and it wasn't until May that we actually got to the front line. And after a mission that we were part of a crossing force that was supposed to take a bridgehead over the Inhulets, which is in the northeastern part of the Mykolaievska Oblast. That after that mission went to shit, me and my team decided to go our own way. I took the best guys with me and went to, like I said, another unit, left the Legion behind.
Yeah. And can you tell us about some of these bad experiences that you had with the Legion? Because I've heard of a lot of corruption, planned suicide missions, things like this. Of course, I haven't experienced it myself, so I rely on gentlemen who have sort of been there, done that, and their experiences.
Okay, so to clarify this, I was in the Alphas, the supposedly special forces of the Legion under the Secret Service of Ukraine, GUR, or the GUR? Yeah, I think DUI, or no, DIU, Directorate of Intelligence of Ukraine is the for the American viewers. So there, to start, I don't know of any suicide missions that were planned as suicide missions. I know of comrades that died, like Grady Korpazi, for example, who was with me in Bucha. He was a fellow team leader in Bucha. Or it's the Scott Ridley, I think was the other one that got killed. because of just pure negligence and poor planning, because people were sent to the same OPs over and over, even after though they had been hit by artillery. And it had nothing to do with the fact that there was no malicious intent. It was just sheer stupidity. And at some point, when people started to no longer do these missions, after people died, they sent the next squad in that just evacuated the dead, and told them, okay, now you go back into that hole where, three of the other guys just died. And they said no, and none of them, and there were no repercussions, right? So no one was reprimanded for refusing those orders. So yeah, that's what I have to say about suicide missions. Everything else, though, the corruption, guns, being loaded into civilian cars in the middle of the night, never to be seen again, bayonets that were supposed to be there, that at some point just dematerialized, drone guns that apparently never made it there, Glocks that went missing after 2 days. All of that I can attest to. I can attest to lying, constant fucking lying, mostly from the Ukrainians, mostly from the upper echelons, people like Taras or Sasha that we were under, but also just on your level, constant lying, constant misinformation, gaslighting, just blatant fucking gaslighting. And of course, rough mistreatment. So I had the guys in my team actually, while I was in Mykolaiv, he was in Kiev with Sasha, and he had Sasha pull a gun on him and demand that he hand over his combat gear,
Right.
which he purchased for the unit.
Yeah, wow. And you speak about this of loading guns into cars, going missing, with Sasha pointing a gun at a gentleman and then having that handed over. What did that make you feel like continuing the fight? Because I know if I was part of something like that in not my country, I probably would have been like, fuck yeah, and left.
I knew that I had to leave the Legion, but I couldn't leave Ukraine because like I said, I had a lot of really beautiful, lovely experiences with the people, and I was still sympathetic to the average Ukrainian. So I definitely wanted to fight, but I had nowhere else to go. So I stayed for the Legion as long as I felt it was necessary to get the chance to do something. But of course, like I said, the first chance I got, I took, and I didn't look back.
Yeah. And what was that chance?
So that chance was a recently split and reformed volunteer unit. So you will probably know this, probably a lot of viewers won't, but there are probably dozens, if not hundreds, of independent volunteer units. So most volunteers are not actually with the Legions. Most volunteers are either in other volunteer units of, for example, the SBU or the SSO, the Spetsnaz of Ukraine, or they form independent units that either fight really independently or at some point, seek to organize themselves into or integrate themselves into either the SSO, GUR, or the ZSU, the regular army. One of which, for example, is the Norman Brigade that I knew. I think they said they were fighting independently, and only by the end of 2022 became ingrained with the Ukrainian army, got contracts and everything. That was one of these units, except we didn't try to fight on our own. We, from the get-go, refused to do anything without official paperwork, and official uniforms. So we embarked on an odyssey, really an odyssey, to get integrated into this SAO. We went to Bakhmut to sign on there. That didn't work. We went to Mykolaiv on some really just weapon runs. We were honestly we felt more like Chinese warlords in the 1920s. It's like we just joined the local warlord and we hope that we can fight for the government someday. And it was wild. It was fucking wild. And after meeting, I guess, a bigger warlord, for the sake of anonymity, in the book I called him Aravan. Let's say Aravan. Really, I have no idea what he was. I have no idea. He works with the army, but he's not actually in the army. He does what an officer does, but he's not actually an officer. He has a lot of powerful friends and a lot of connections, but no actual legal command power, but somehow does. I have no idea how it works. To me, it always seemed like we just joined the biggest warlord, and this warlord actually worked with the government. So we joined him. And we were integrated into the 59th Motor Rifle Brigade of Ukraine back in Mykolaiv. And that is where I saw most of the fighting. That is where, all the cool Humvee combat footage from me and Yuri came about.
Yes. And with these independent groups, was there any concern from yourself about the legalities of these with your home country and things like this?
So I wasn't concerned with the legality because I, for myself, made clear that I will not fight. I will not use a gun unless I have the proper legal framework and the legal paperwork. Others were not that concerned, but for me, that was an issue. The issue that I had more was the look that this all had and the look that I might get from German secret services, like the Verfassungsschutz, for example, and that I might, go on some very nasty lists when I come back home. Because these volunteer units, both in the Legion and also in the ZSU, there's everything. And I mean, everything, right? Russia likes to talk about Nazis in Ukraine. Those definitely exist, although I haven't met a whole lot. We had Orthodox Jews, we had Islamists, we had Russians, we had Belarusians, people from really every country in the world, pagans, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Nazis, commies, really the whole bunch, right? And of course, the concern is if I get photographed next to the right guy, it doesn't matter what I think of him, it doesn't matter what I'm doing with him, it's a bad look and it might get me on a list. That was my main worry at this time.
That was going to be in my notes, and my next questions was about the lists and legalities coming home. But then as well in this, I've got written about what are your thoughts as a German towards the symbology you do see that is far-right nationalist Nazi symbology. What do you think as a German of seeing that? Are you, well, everyone I think is disgusted by it, but it's more prevalent in some of those units.
It is more prevalent, but the thing is, especially in war, I really don't care about looks. All I care about is how people are treated and how people act. And the thing that I found is this kind of symbology, not just in Ukraine, but a lot of other countries, even in Russia. We had a guy from Russia with swastika tattoos, or a guy from Belarus with swastikas. And when we asked him about it, he says, "Oh, where I come from, this stands for fighting imperialism. This stands for fighting communism." And when we talked to him, it seemed it really seemed to be true. It seemed true that he personally seemed to believe that. And a lot of the reverence for these Nazi symbol really seems to stem from more an ignorance of history than of an actual support of what these symbols mean in Germany. That is just one example. The other example was the other thing is, like I said, it depends on how you act. So we had the guy with the Nazi tattoos. He was a team leader. He was an ardent Islamist, and in his team he had, like I said, pagans, Christians, Muslims, Jews, and there was never any problem, right? So the guy with the swastika tattoo, he didn't care that, in the evening the Jew reps tefillin next to the guy who brings out his prayer mat and prays to Mecca. And there was never any trouble with a guy like this. At the same time, though, there was racism, there was anti-Semitism, definitely. But ironically, when it came from the people without the Nazi tattoos, without the swastika patches, without the paraphernalia. You know what I mean?
Yeah. What about this being like Bandera being held in high regard?
I don't know where that come from. I've never, in my time in Ukraine, nobody ever mentioned Bandera. The only people that mentioned Bandera were the Russian propagandists. And I've never talked to anyone in Ukraine about Bandera, and I've never heard anyone talk about Bandera. I know now that there is this exact same problem, this kind of ignorance of history, and that there's people in Ukraine who revere Bandera as this Ukrainian freedom fighter that just either simply really don't know or brush aside the horrible things that his unit actually did in the 30s and 20s.
Yes. So once you got that official military, say, I guess, permission paperwork to go through, and you mentioned there that there was a guy who was unofficial but had all these contacts. That's something I think a lot of people, at least from my background being Australian, when you go to a country like Ukraine, and this is with a lot of, probably the majority of countries, you're like, hang on, this doesn't work like that back home, where you've got these like figures who have so much pull and support, but aren't like, well, but who actually is he? It's like, oh no, but he knows the chief of police and the army and this and that. You have like fixers isn't the right word for it, but I'll use it. It's almost like a high-end fixer. It's very interesting. Where did you then go as like your first period of like combat missions with that unit, and how did that differ from what you initially saw at the Legion?
So I always break it down in two phases. It was before the Kharkiv offensive and after the Kharkiv offensive. In the beginning, we pretty much only did infantry missions, and usually they kind of work like this. We get a target, we were called out in the middle of the night. We get a really crude and short a briefing, that's even shorter and cruder for us non-Russian speakers, just broken down in some broken English. And the target was usually like a tree line or some hangars or some like the edge of a village or a water plant. And then we zoom through the night in a bunch of Humvees. We dismount a couple kilometers away from the Russian positions, and then we march through the night and attack, usually by the break of dawn. Ideally, sometimes people promised us like artillery support, like, oh yeah, you're gonna go there, and then there'll be mortars, and then you attack, which never materialized. It was always like, oh yeah, mortars, Mortars didn't show up. We do Sturm anyways. And then like there were only two modes. Either intelligence was incorrect and there were no Russians there, or intelligence was incorrect and instead of like 15 separatists, we were fighting 150 VDV and everything went to shit. It's really a miracle how few of us died, and we had a lot of close calls. That particular mission with the VDV, we're supposed to take a village. We were around roughly 40, 45 people, and we attacked not knowing the enemy's number. We took a bunch of Russians by surprise. We took 2 prisoners, VDV, from whom we knew that we learned the actual strength of the detachment in that village. And as soon as we found that out, we had to make a fighting retreat while the enemy tried to chase us with BMD 3, so BMD 4, the airborne airborne IFVs with the BMP 3 turret. Yeah, that was shit. That was utter shit. But morale takes a hit. A couple of guys die, and then the next week you're doing the next kind of shit. At that point, I was actually injured. I took a bullet to the ankle, grazed. Like a bullet grazed my ankle, and I was out of combat for a couple of weeks. And in that time, the Kharkiv offensive happened, and at that point, everything seemed to change, and it wasn't exactly obvious why. We started to do mission right at the crack of dawn, where we'd attack in the late morning, or sometimes even in the middle of day, with vehicles. You've seen the combat footage. You talked to Yuri. I think everyone has seen those Humvee videos by now. The thunder runs into Russian positions, oftentimes like in the morning, the crack of dawn, waking them up with fire after them not noticing 3 Humvees driving into their village. Putting fire on the enemy, dismounting, putting more fire on, and then retreating. At that point, we barely tried to actually take positions. We barely actually tried to hold positions, because the problem really was never killing the Russians. The problem was never dislodging the Russians from positions. The problem was all the time that we went there and we drove the Russians out of the positions. We, sometimes without casualties, we cleared a trench, killed a lot of Russians, took a lot of prisoners. We took the trench, but then we had to sit in the Russian trench under artillery fire for a day or two until we had to pull out. So oftentimes what we did was merely go there, do reconnaissance by fire, hopefully take out some orcs, and then bolt. So that was the main sort of mission that we did.
Speaking that first mission, you speak about fighting against the VDV, who are the Russian paratroopers. What sort of capability or skill did you find coming from a highly skilled military as the German military? How did you find their warfighting skill and tactic?
I didn't really find any tactic or fighting skill. I was really, really, really shocked how piss poor the Russian performance were, and it was unbelievable. It started off with the fact that we walked. Really, we just leisurely strolled at first daylight, not even under the cover of night, into a village, right, that is held by 100 troops. And we still managed to take prisoners because everyone's asleep. And this is not like some kind of far-off location. No, you have a village here that is the closest Russian position to the front. 1 kilometer that way is the Ukrainian position in another village, and there are no guards. None. And this didn't just happen once. This happened multiple times. Like I said, we drove our Humvees into a village and woke them up with machine guns. Right? So it's somehow the VDV don't post guards. And not just the VDV. In Ternopil, where I ended up getting wounded, we were fighting against Spetsnaz GRU, who had all the artillery support, T90M, the best helmets and plates that your money can buy, and they were piss poor at fighting. They broke seconds after we went in their trench.
Wow.
It's staggering. And I think the reason why really is because those really highly trained highly specialized troops are either in Bakhmut in the east or, dead somewhere around Hostomel.
Yeah.
And probably because that theater just wasn't relevant to the Russians at the time, they didn't commit the real trained troops. So yeah, they were VDV. Yeah, they had the equipment of VDV, but they were piss poor. And even the people that we took from the Spetsnaz, they looked like they've been just scraped together in some fucking DMV corner in Eastern Russia. They were fat. You had one or two guys that looked like you would imagine a soldier, and most of them just looks like poor Mobics. And this was even before the mobilization was announced.
Did you come up against any really formidable soldiers?
The artillery was quite formidable.
Yes.
But no, and this is, I really don't think this is really that I can speak for all fronts at all time. This was specifically in my area, this part of the front. The quality of soldiers was shit. The equipment was good. Like I said, T90Ms, Grads, 150 2mm howitzer, drones at every step, BMD4s. Yeah, that was the Russian army that I witnessed.
And you mentioned in that you guys took, on occasion, I'm not sure how many occasions, you took POWs. How was the treatment of them once they'd been captured? Because we've seen some horror things of some executions, we've seen some mistreatment, and especially coming from a NATO standard military like URI, where there's, many rights afforded to POWs that we see breached. How was your experience with that?
So I can only attest to the treatment of POWs at the front line. And it was mixed. So it was the most normal thing in the world to pose with them, to make pictures with them, to humiliate them. It was always among our Ukrainian comrades. It was part of the good tone to put a gun on their chest and say, "Oh, say Slava Ukraini," or make them say Putin Huilo, stuff like that. That was normal. That was normalized for our Ukrainian comrades. That did not happen in my units. That did not happen by any of the volunteers I was with, but it happened. It was done by the Ukrainians. Also, what was relatively normal was just to slap or to beat prisoners. Sometimes if they weren't doing anything fast enough, sometimes just because you felt like it or because somebody felt like it and just went past him, slapped him on the head, stuff like that. What I did see on one occasion was, and those were the Spetsnaz guys. One was beaten. Ukrainian comrade, he put him on his knees. He made him beg for his life. He stabbed him in the thigh with a knife, and then sent him on his way. And later that same day, I don't remember who it was. It was not the same guy. It was someone else. They took 3 prisoners of war in the nearby forest, and you could just hear, and they came back without prisoners. I think you can fill in the blanks. That is what I saw, and that is what it seemed to me like the the deeds of individuals, so individual war crimes. There was actually an investigation launched by the unit into who killed the prisoners, into mistreatment of prisoners. However, I'm not aware that any kind of consequences were resulted from that. So, yeah, it definitely, to some degree, it happens on both sides. Absolutely.
Yeah. How does that make you feel, being the side you're fighting against a lot of that? Because, the idea is the Russians are doing this, we're not that. How does it feel being on because at the end of the day, you say, yes, it's the individual, but military, the whole uniform is uniform, if that makes sense.
Yes, of course, one bad apple spoils the batch. Honestly, of course it bothered me. And of course, I would never allow this in my unit, but I have no power over my Ukrainian superiors. So there was not much I can do, which of course pissed me off. But to be quite honest, I went into this war expecting this, because if you go to war, you have to expect these kind of things. This happens in every war, in every army, in every period of time, everywhere. This was done by the Allies in World War II and World War I. This was done by American soldiers in the Korean War and the Koreans in the Korean War. This was done everywhere. Correct. Aggressor or defender, it doesn't matter. It's done everywhere, and you have to accept that it happens to some extent if you go to war. That doesn't mean I liked it. That doesn't mean I wasn't pissed off with it. But at the end of the day, that doesn't justify any of the crimes that Russia is committing, and it doesn't justify the Russian war in any way, and it doesn't make the war that Russia wages any less reprehensible. So it doesn't change why I fight.
Yes. Yeah, it's just interesting, and we've talked about some poor mistreatment of POWs and Russian soldiers, and there's always a flip side to it. Did you see anything that, I guess, warmed your heart of humanity of, wounded guys and providing good care and whatever from there?
You mean specifically to the Russians?
Yes.
No.
Right.
No. There was no. There was no brotherly anything. Especially not in that phase of the war. I think Bucha really destroyed any chance of that.
Would they receive medical treatment if taken or injured?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's more what I was meaning. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. We gave them, medical treatment. We actually, there was one thing. The guys in the VDV that we took in Lubomirovska, we dragged them out of their spalnik. We dragged them out of their sleeping bag, and they had like naked feet. And then the enemy tank started to shoot, and we had to run, and we had to drag them behind. Not drag, but had to, take them with us in their naked feet. So my comrade actually ran after the fire had already started, ran back in the house to grab the one guy's slippers, slippers. So he didn't have to walk. I think we walked like 12 kilometers that day, just the fuck out of there. And yeah, he actually ran back in to grab the guy's slippers, because how shit it will be with bare feet. So I guess you can count that.
Yeah. And what other missions did you guys do on these while with that unit until, I guess, your period of then getting wounded? And we'll talk about this.
So those were really the only kinds of mission that I did. Of course, I did multiple of those. Multiple attempted, a lot of them were broken off. And yeah, so some were successful. Most were either broken off or, didn't even begin at all or failed. That also happened. But yeah, that really was the kinds of mission that we're going for. Either speedy vehicle missions or trench clearing.
Yes. And as someone who, you said your real time of experience with combat was first in Ukraine and first engaged with the enemy, how did you feel about, killing other men, being in contact, initially, things like this? How does that sit with yourself?
So, especially with first things first. The killing and the thought of killing and the knowing that you have to do it in war if push comes to shove, it really doesn't bother me. It's just something that you've come to accept. It's just it's nothing you really think about, especially not in battle. Like once the bullets are flying, you just act, and thinking you do later.
Yes.
In how it was in contact, so it was scary, being in contact. Artillery definitely was a scary experience. The thing that always got me was the whistling, the
yes. Yeah.
It sounds just like in the movies, and it is 1,000 times more terrifying. Especially when your brain has made the connection to what comes next.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, being under fire when the bullets are really, really close, when you can hear the crack above your head or the side is that is just something you never forget. That is something, these moments, these feelings, and especially the sounds more than anything are burned into your mind. Yeah.
It's funny that with high intensity things like that, high stress, like super high stress environments, that a lot of the time the visuals aren't what you remember. It's things like sound. For me, it's smell.
Oh yeah.
Like
the smell of fresh blood.
Yeah. I got hit in Oriki fairly, like we got under a lot of fire. And if you asked me to visualize things and say what vehicles there, whatever, I probably couldn't tell you, but the smell and things like that. And the smell of death is, for those who've experienced it, personally, I actually think it's a primitive link to our brain that doesn't like that smell, because it's not a bad smell. It's almost sweet, if that makes a sense. But it's like primitive. You're like, there's something tickling in your brain of like, don't go near that. That's not good. I'm not sure if I'm just spitballing. That's how my brain worked towards it.
Yeah, I absolutely get it. Yeah. I honestly, the smell of death really wasn't that big of a problem. I guess we were lucky in Bucha and Irpin that it was so dry and cold that the smells really weren't an issue. But what really stuck to me was the smell of blood. So I'm a hunter, so I thought I was used to the smell of blood, but I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the smell of human blood. There's just something different about it. But it stuck with me more than any deer, any hog that I killed.
Yeah. And how was that coming home? How have you gone with your mental health, your emotional health? I'm not sure if you're spiritual or religious, but how's that all been?
So by the time I went home, I was already out of the fight for at least a month or over a month. So because I was injured, I was in the hospital, and I only have a couple of minutes left, by the way. So
Oh, sorry. Yep.
yeah. Um, so I was in the hospital, and there I already had time to think about it, to come to terms with it. Also, I've been starting to work on the book, and that really, I didn't anticipate it, I didn't plan it, but it really, really, really helped me to relive those things and to come to terms with it, to let it go. And I can noticeably feel that these impressions, the smells, the sounds, the anxiety of the stress of the battlefield is getting away. It's getting, it's fading away.
Yes,
And that's a good sign.
for sure. And when can we expect this book? Will the book be published and available for me and my followers to purchase and read?
Well, if your followers are German, they can buy it right now. It has been published in April, actually,
Okay.
but there is no English version planned yet. Although I hope that will change. We have something planned, and maybe they'll make the publisher go, okay, we'll translate it in English. Um, yeah.
I'll put the link for that down below. I was also thinking, and just off the top of my head, you could potentially read it audiobook in English. That might work. I'm not sure if I'm throwing anything away here, but I know
I
myself I'd be very interested.
yeah, I'm not sure if I'm actually allowed to. I have to consult the contract again. It has to be like signed off by the
Yes.
publisher. But yeah, I had that idea already. Um, yeah, okay. I I'm 8 minutes over, so I can
I apologize.
already smell the trouble brewing in my
Say,
bedroom.
blame it on Willie. Blame it on Willie.
I
Mate, look,
She never buys it. Okay,
yeah,
More other people than you have tried it. She never buys it.
yeah. Show her a photo of me and she might be like, oh, Bill, that guy. But mate, look, Jonas, thank you so much for your time. I've got pages of questions and things, and let's do this again at one point. I'd be very, very interested to continue on, and I thank you for your openness and honesty and for everything you've done.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm so happy that you had me here. Um, Next time we do it, maybe not in the evening. I really hope we could do this maybe in the morning here, or even in the afternoon, like a couple hours earlier.
Yes,
Okay.
that's my bad.
No worries. No worries. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you, brother. You too. Bye bye.